Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The wind chime refused to stir. As I stepped onto the porch, my feet skimmed the boards without the expected creaks, a muted passage over a place usually so lively. The light switch offered no illumination, just a soft click swallowed by the dark. I reached for the familiar edge of the banister, its wood cold and distant, a surface too smooth, as if untouched by hands. Moving further inside, I listened for the groan of the settling walls, but the same hollow silence persisted. The floor, unyielding beneath my soles, felt artificial, like a stage set. My eyes adjusted slowly, revealing the furniture's sharp outlines, each piece too precisely positioned, as if pretending to belong. The curtain edges floated still, held by an unseen tension, leaving me with a question pressed into my palm like a misplaced gesture. The coffee cup sits on the kitchen counter, its ceramic rim stained with lipstick in a shade I've never worn. The color is deeper than my usual choices, a burgundy that speaks of confidence I don't possess. When I lift it, the weight feels wrong too light, as if someone drained it hours ago. The smell rising from the dregs carries hints of vanilla and something else, something medicinal that makes my throat constrict. I set it down carefully, noting how my fingerprints smudge the surface where other prints already ghost the porcelain. The pattern doesn't match my usual grip. The photograph on the mantelpiece draws my attention next. In it, I'm standing beside someone whose face has been carefully torn away, leaving only a shoulder and partial arm visible. My smile in the image seems forced, stretched too wide, and my eyes hold a wariness I don't remember feeling. The frame itself bears small scratches along its silver edge, as though it's been handled roughly, moved frequently from place to place. Behind the glass, the corner of the photo shows signs of water damage, creating a bloom of discoloration that spreads like a bruise across what used to be sky. The carpet beneath the frame tells its own story. A circular stain marks the spot where something once sat, another frame, perhaps, or a plant. The fibers there are compressed, flattened by weight over time, creating a perfect ring of absence. When I kneel to touch the mark, my fingers come away slightly damp, though I can't identify the source of the moisture. The carpet's original color seems different here, protected from sunlight and wear, revealing how much the surrounding area has faded. The telephone on the side table holds a particular stillness. Its black receiver rests in the cradle at an odd angle, as if someone replaced it hastily. When I lift it to my ear, expecting the familiar dial tone, I hear only a soft static punctuated by distant sounds, voices, maybe, or just the whisper of old connections failing. The cord shows signs of stretching, kinked and twisted in places where it's been pulled taut. Near the base, I notice tiny scratches in the plastic, deliberate marks that might be tally marks, or simply the nervous scraping of fingernails. The kitchen window overlooks what should be the garden, but the view seems wrong somehow. The proportions don't match my memory, the fence appears closer than it should be, and the large oak that dominated the yard has vanished entirely. In its place, bare earth shows through patchy grass, a roughly circular area where nothing grows. The soil there looks recently disturbed, darker than the surrounding ground. When I press my face to the glass, my breath fogs the surface, revealing fingerprints already there, pressed from the inside as if someone else had stood in this exact spot, searching the same view. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom contains bottles I don't recognize. The labels bear my name, but the medications are unfamiliar, long chemical names that sound serious, permanent. The prescription dates seem recent, though I have no memory of visiting a doctor. One bottle rattles when I shake it, nearly empty, while others remain unopened, their safety seals intact. The mirror on the cabinet door reflects my face with a slight distortion, making my features appear subtly different, as if I'm looking at a sister rather than myself. The bedroom closet holds clothes that fit me perfectly but feel foreign against my skin. Dresses in colors I avoid, shoes with worn soles that match my gait exactly, jackets with pockets that contain receipts and ticket stubs from places I've never been. The hangers are arranged with mechanical precision, each garment spaced identically from the next. At the back of the closet, pushed behind the winter coats, I find a suitcase I don't remember owning. Its corners are scuffed from travel, and airline tags still cling to the handle, their destinations obscured by wear and weather. The diary on the nightstand opens to pages filled with my handwriting, but the words describe experiences that aren't mine. The entries detail conversations I never had, places I never visited, emotions I never felt. The pen strokes match my usual style, the way I cross my T's and loop my G's, but the content reads like someone else's life transcribed in my hand. Certain entries have been crossed out heavily, the ink pressed so hard it's torn through the paper. Others show signs of erasure, ghostly impressions of words I apparently thought better of recording. The basement door, when I finally gather courage to open it, releases air that tastes of damp earth and something sweetly chemical. The stairs descend into darkness that my flashlight barely penetrates. Each step down feels like a descent into someone else's house, someone else's secrets. The walls down there are newer than upstairs, the concrete still showing the smooth patterns left by wooden forms. In one corner, a pile of old newspapers sits bound with twine, their headlines visible but somehow irrelevant, as if they're props rather than actual news. The washing machine in the basement contains clothes that are still damp, though I don't remember starting a load. The fabric feels cold and clammy, and when I lift a shirt to examine it, I notice small tears that look deliberate rather than accidental. The water in the bottom of the tub has a pinkish tinge that might be rust from old pipes or might be something else entirely. The detergent bottle beside the machine is nearly empty, though I could swear it was full just days ago. The tool bench along the far wall holds implements arranged with surgical precision. Each screwdriver, each wrench occupies its designated outline drawn in permanent marker on the pegboard, but several spaces remain empty, their corresponding tools missing. The outlines suggest nothing sinister: a hammer, a pair of pliers, a small saw, yet their absence feels significant, purposeful. The bench surface bears scratches and stains that speak of recent use, though I can't recall any projects requiring such tools. The car in the garage tells perhaps the most unsettling story of all. The odometer shows hundreds of miles I don't remember driving. The passenger seat is adjusted for someone taller than me, and the radio is tuned to a station I never listened to. In the glove compartment, I find maps marked with routes I've never taken, destinations circled in red ink. The trunk, when I finally work up the nerve to check it, contains a shovel with dirt still clinging to its blade and a plastic tarp folded with military precision. The garden shed, barely visible in the growing dusk, holds the final pieces of this puzzle I'm afraid to solve. Inside, bags of lime sit stacked against one wall, several of them opened and partially used. The floor shows drag marks in the dust, paths that lead from the door to the back corner where the earth looks recently disturbed. A pair of gloves lies discarded on the workbench, their fabric stained with substances I don't want to identify. The air here carries that same sweetly chemical smell I noticed in the basement, but stronger, more insistent. The house around me continues its strange silence as I catalog each discovery. The wind chime on the porch remains motionless despite the breeze I can see moving through the trees. The rooms hold their breath, waiting for me to piece together the story they're telling. But the harder I try to remember, the more the memories seem to slip away, like water through cupped hands. I am left standing in a place that should be home, but feels like a carefully constructed lie, surrounded by evidence of a life I may have lived but cannot recall. The mirror in the hallway reflects my face one final time as I prepare to leave these discoveries behind. But the woman looking back at me wears an expression I don't recognize, a mixture of guilt and resignation that suggests she knows exactly what all these clues mean. Her eyes hold secrets mine don't remember keeping, and when I raise my hand to touch the glass, she hesitates just a moment before mirroring the gesture, as if we're not quite the same person after all. Story 2. The pattern asterisk. I always assumed it was coincidental, the way the wind would shift the curtain in the room across the courtyard. Without fail, it happened on alternate days like an unspoken agreement with nature. The curtain would flutter the same way, a gentle rise, then a sweeping fall. But last week, as the sun set, the curtain barely moved. It was a slight tremor instead of the usual dance. Yesterday it didn't rise at all, just a slow, heavy sway. Today the breeze is strong, yet the curtain stays perfectly still. I can't shake the feeling that something else has decided to intervene. The apartment building where I live has thin walls and thinner boundaries between lives. You learn to recognize the rhythms of your neighbors without meaning to. The woman across the courtyard was no different. Her routine was as predictable as morning coffee. She would water her plants before dawn, the silhouette of her movements casting familiar shadows against that white curtain. The sound of her radio would drift across the narrow space between our buildings, always the same station, always the same volume. But routines can break, and when they do, the silence becomes deafening. It started with the radio. One morning, it simply wasn't there. No gentle hum of voices discussing weather or traffic, no soft music filtering through the early air. I found myself listening harder, straining to catch any sound from her apartment. The curtain still moved then, still followed its predictable pattern, but something felt hollow about it. I told myself I was being paranoid. People change their habits. Maybe she bought headphones. Maybe she moved the radio to another room. Maybe she was tired of the same voices every morning. I had no right to expect her routine to remain constant just because I had grown comfortable with it. The building superintendent lives on the ground floor, and I've spoken with him maybe 3 times in the 2 years I've lived here. He's the kind of man who nods instead of speaking, who fixes things quickly and disappears before you can offer thanks. When I saw him replacing a lock on the mailboxes, I found myself walking over. "Everything all right in the building?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up from his work, squinting at me as if trying to place my face. "Why do you ask?" "Just seemed quiet lately." He went back to the lock, his hands working the screws with mechanical precision. "Quiet's good. Quiet means no problems. But quiet can mean other things too." The curtain stopped moving completely on a Wednesday. I remember because Wednesday was trash day, and I was taking my bins to the curb when I glanced up at her window. The fabric hung limp and undisturbed, even though the wind was strong enough to rattle the loose gate at the building's entrance. I stood there longer than I should have, watching for any sign of movement behind that still curtain. That evening, I called the building management company. The woman who answered sounded tired, like she'd been dealing with complaints all day. "I'm concerned about a neighbor," I said. "I haven't seen her in a while." What apartment? I realized I didn't know the number. It's across the courtyard from mine, third floor, facing west. And you are. I gave her my information, feeling foolish for not knowing more about someone I'd been observing for months. We can't discuss individual tenants, she said, but if you're concerned about someone's welfare, you should contact the authorities. The authorities, the word felt heavy, official. It meant crossing a line from curious neighbor to something else entirely. I didn't call that night. Instead, I sat by my window watching her apartment. The lights never came on. The curtain never moved. The silence stretched across the courtyard like a physical thing. The next morning, I knocked on the superintendent's door. He answered wearing the same work clothes, the same neutral expression. The woman in the third floor apartment across the courtyard, I said. When did you last see her? His eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Her curtain hasn't moved in days. She always had a routine, and now there's nothing. He stepped back, not inviting me in, but not closing the door either. People travel. People change their habits. But the curtain, what about it? I realized how it sounded, explaining that I'd been watching a piece of fabric move in the wind. It's not just the curtain. There's no radio, no lights, no movement at all. He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the door frame. I'll check on her. When I check on her. The conversation was over, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. Not what he said, but how he said it, like he already knew something I didn't. That afternoon, I saw him crossing the courtyard with his key ring. He moved with purpose, not the casual pace of routine maintenance. I watched from my window as he entered the building across from mine. He was inside for longer than it should take to knock on a door and get no answer. When he emerged, he looked up at my window. Even from that distance, I could see something had changed in his posture. He stood straighter, more alert, like a man who just confirmed his worst suspicions. I waited for him to call someone, the police, an ambulance, someone, but he simply walked back to his building and disappeared inside. The waiting became unbearable. I found myself checking her window every few minutes, looking for any sign of life. The curtain remained still, the apartment dark. Whatever the superintendent had found, he wasn't sharing it with anyone. 3 days later, I saw a different man entering her building. He wore a suit and carried a briefcase, moving with the careful efficiency of someone conducting business. He was inside for less than an hour, and when he left, he was carrying a small box. I intercepted him at the courtyard gate. "Excuse me," I said. "Are you here about the woman in the third floor apartment?" He stopped, studying my face with professional interest. "And you are?" "A neighbor. I've been worried about her." "Worried how?" I explained about the routine, the curtain, the sudden silence. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if my observations confirmed something he already knew. "She's fine," he said finally. "She's relocated for personal reasons." Relocated. Family emergency. She asked us to handle the apartment transition quietly. The words felt rehearsed, too smooth. What about her things? He shifted the box to his other arm. She took what she needed. The rest will be handled appropriately. He started to leave, but I stepped closer. If she's fine, why haven't the lights been on? Why hasn't anyone been in the apartment until now? His expression hardened. I think you've been paying too much attention to things that aren't your concern." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I stepped back, letting him pass, but I memorized his face, his walk, the way he held that box like it contained something fragile. That night I couldn't sleep. The man's words echoed in my mind, but it wasn't what he said that bothered me. It was what he didn't say. He never asked which apartment I was talking about. He knew exactly which neighbor I meant, as if he'd been expecting someone to ask questions. I started keeping a log, every person who entered or left her building, every car that parked in the courtyard, every change in the building's rhythm. The superintendent began avoiding eye contact when he saw me. The woman at the management company stopped taking my calls. But patterns emerge even when people try to hide them. The same suited man returned twice more, each time carrying boxes or papers. On his third visit, I followed him. He drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town where he met with two other men. They transferred the boxes to a larger vehicle, spoke briefly, then separated. I waited until they were gone, then approached the storage facility office. The clerk was young, bored, willing to chat. "Busy morning," I said, gesturing toward the loading area. "Yeah, that guy's been renting units all month. Weird how much stuff people accumulate." "All month. Started right after that woman went missing." My blood went cold, missing. The clerk's face changed, like he'd realized he'd said too much. I mean, moved away. People move away all the time. But he'd said missing first, and the word hung in the air between us like an accusation. I drove home with my hands shaking, my mind racing through everything I'd observed. The still curtain, the superintendent's evasiveness, the suited man's rehearsed answers, and now this slip from a storage facility clerk. That evening, I called the police. The officer who took my statement was patient but skeptical. I told him about the routine, the sudden change, the men with boxes, the clerk's comment about someone going missing. He wrote it all down, but I could see doubt in his eyes. "We'll look into it," he said, "but people have a right to privacy. Moving away isn't a crime." But what if she didn't move away? "Do you have any evidence of foul play?" I didn't. I had observations, suspicions, a feeling that something was wrong, but no evidence. 2 weeks later, the officer called me back. They'd spoken with the building management, the superintendent, and the man I'd described. Everyone's story aligned. The woman had left voluntarily due to a family emergency. Her rent was paid through the end of the month. Her belongings were being handled according to her wishes. "Case closed?" I asked. "There was no case to begin with." But I couldn't let it go. The curtain still hung motionless in her window, and sometimes, late at night, I thought I saw shadows moving behind it. Not her shadows, different ones. I started researching missing persons reports, scanning local news, looking for any mention of a woman who disappeared around the time her routine ended. Nothing matched exactly, but there were gaps, inconsistencies in the official narrative that made me question everything I'd been told. The superintendent quit his job and moved away. The management company changed hands. The suited man never returned, but sometimes other men would visit her apartment, always carrying boxes, always looking like they belonged there. And the curtain never moved again. I still live across the courtyard, still watch that window. New tenants moved in eventually, a young couple who hung different curtains and kept different hours. But sometimes, when the wind is strong and their curtains flutter in that familiar pattern, I remember how it used to be. I remember the routine that ended so abruptly, the questions that never got answered, the woman who might have moved away or might have simply vanished into the silence that swallows inconvenient truths. The official story is that she relocated for personal reasons. The evidence supports this version of events. Everyone involved confirms the same details. But I know what I observed, and I know that patterns don't break without cause. Somewhere in those storage units, in those boxes carried by careful men, in the space between official truth and lived reality, lies an answer I may never find. The wind still blows across the courtyard, still moves curtains in windows where people live their predictable lives. But I've learned that predictability is fragile, that routines can end without warning, and that sometimes the most disturbing thing about a mystery isn't what you discover. It's what you never get the chance to discover at all. Story 3. It wasn't unusual for the hallway to be dark at this hour. The walls seemed a little closer than they used to be, but maybe that was just my imagination. The carpet had a new stain, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. No footsteps echoed last night, though I often heard them. A breeze slipped past the curtain, a subtle reminder of how easy it was to forget to close a window. The lock on the cabinet showed no signs of tampering, but I didn't trust it enough to check inside. I left my cup on the table empty and wondered if anyone else had noticed. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't check if it was truly shut. The morning light filtered through the blinds differently now, casting shadows that hadn't been there before. I tell myself this is how it happened. I came home from work that evening, tired but alert enough to notice the small changes. The apartment felt wrong, though nothing obvious had been disturbed. My neighbor had been acting strange for weeks, avoiding eye contact in the elevator, fumbling with keys at odd hours. I'd seen the way she watched my door through her peephole, the tiny click of the cover sliding back into place whenever I passed. She'd been having troubles with her boyfriend, loud arguments that bled through the thin walls. I'd heard glass breaking, furniture scraping across the floor, then sudden silence that lasted for days. When I finally saw her again, she wore long sleeves despite the heat, kept her head down, spoke in whispers when she spoke at all. It made sense that she might need somewhere safe to hide something, somewhere he wouldn't think to look. The spare key I kept under the decorative stone by my door had been moved, just slightly. The scratches around my lock were fresh, barely visible but there if you looked closely. She must have waited until I left for my evening shift, slipped inside and hidden whatever she needed to keep safe. The cabinet in my hallway was the obvious choice, tucked away where casual visitors wouldn't notice, secured with a lock that looked more substantial than it actually was. But my skin prickles when I think about that night, a sensation that starts at the base of my neck and spreads downward like cold water. The smell in the hallway wasn't just mustiness from poor ventilation. It was something else, something organic and wrong that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My hands shake slightly when I remember reaching for the light switch, finding it already in the up position, though the bulb remained dark. The cup on my table, the one I supposedly left empty, still held warmth when I touched it the next morning. Steam rose from liquid that shouldn't have been there, bitter coffee that I didn't remember making. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed scratches on my arms that I couldn't explain, thin red lines like paper cuts that stung when I noticed them. Sometimes I catch myself standing in front of that cabinet, key in hand, having no memory of walking there. The metal feels familiar between my fingers, worn smooth in places that suggest frequent use. When I blink, I see flashes of the interior, shelves that should be empty but aren't, objects wrapped in cloth that I don't want to unwrap. The neighbor's apartment has been quiet for days now. No footsteps, no television, no running water. The smell from the hallway grows stronger near her door, sweet and cloying like flowers left too long in water. When I press my ear to the wall we share, I hear nothing but my own heartbeat, loud and irregular. I found soil under my fingernails this morning, dark earth that crumbles when I try to wash it away. My shoes by the door are clean, no trace of dirt or grass, but my clothes smell like night air and something else, something I can't identify but recognize in the deepest part of my memory. The taste in my mouth is metallic, coating my tongue with the flavor of old pennies. The logical part of my mind insists on the first version. She needed help, she used my apartment, she's lying low until the danger passes. But my body tells a different story, one written in aches and pains that appear without explanation. My knees are bruised as if I'd been kneeling on hard ground. My back hurts in the specific way that comes from lifting something heavy, something that didn't want to be moved. I check the cabinet obsessively now, running my fingers along the lock, testing the weight of the door. Sometimes it feels different, heavier or lighter than it should be. The key turns too easily, as if the mechanism has been oiled recently. Inside, the shadows seem deeper than they should be, extending beyond what the small space should contain. My dreams are filled with digging, the rhythmic sound of metal striking earth. I wake with dirt under my nails that wasn't there when I went to sleep, my muscles sore from exertion I don't remember. The shower drain is clogged with soil that swirls down in muddy spirals, carrying with it fragments of things I don't want to examine too closely. The building's superintendent asked me about the smell yesterday, wondering if I'd noticed anything unusual. His eyes were concerned, professional, but there was something else there, a wariness that made me step back from my doorway. He mentioned that other tenants had complained that they were considering calling someone to investigate. I told him I hadn't noticed anything, but my voice sounded strange even to me, too high and too quick. After he left, I stood in my hallway for a long time, breathing deeply, trying to separate the familiar scents from the ones that didn't belong. The air tasted thick, almost solid, like breathing through wet cloth. The stain on the carpet has grown larger, spreading in an irregular pattern that suggests liquid seeping up from below. When I touch it, my fingers come away damp with something that isn't water. The color is wrong, too dark, too red, and it doesn't dry no matter how long I wait. Both versions of events feel equally real now, equally false. I am the helpful neighbor who provided temporary sanctuary, and I am something else entirely, something that moves through the building at night with purposes I can't acknowledge in daylight. The cabinet holds her secrets, and it holds mine. The key in my pocket is both salvation and damnation. I catch myself planning things I don't remember deciding to do, making preparations for events that haven't happened yet or have already happened in ways I can't quite recall. The tools in my closet are clean now, but they weren't always. The plastic sheeting folded neatly on the top shelf still crinkles with recent use. When I close my eyes, I see two different endings to this story, both terrible, both true. In one, she escapes and I am left with the knowledge of what I helped her hide. In the other, there was no escape, only the sound of digging in the dark and the weight of choices that can't be undone. The hallway grows darker each day, the walls pressing closer, the stain spreading wider. I leave my cup on the table, empty or full, and wonder if anyone else has noticed. As I close the door behind me, I still don't check if it's truly shut, because some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed again. Story 4. The desk drawer. The desk drawer was slightly open upon initial inspection. The adjacent papers remained undisturbed, edges aligned precisely along the table's surface. The pen lay parallel to the notepad, untouched since prior documentation. Shadows cast by the overhead lamp appeared consistent with the time of day, yet the lamp switch was in the off position. The carpet showed no signs of indentations or movement. The window latch was secure, exhibiting no signs of tampering or force. Despite the absence of drafts, the curtain moved intermittently. I stood in the doorway for what felt like several minutes, taking in these details with the methodical approach that had served me well during my years as an insurance investigator. The homeowner had called our office claiming a break-in, but nothing appeared missing. No jewelry taken, no electronics disturbed, no cash removed from the envelope she kept in her bedroom dresser. Just that drawer pulled open exactly 3 inches, as if someone had been searching for something specific and stopped the moment they found it. The woman sat in her kitchen, hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since grown cold. Her fingers trembled slightly when she spoke, but her voice remained steady. She had discovered the drawer that morning after returning from her weekly grocery run. Everything else seemed normal, she insisted. The front door had been locked when she returned. The security system showed no breach, yet someone had been in her home in this room at this desk. I asked her what she kept in that drawer. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hallway before returning to meet mine. "Just papers," she said. "Old bills, warranties, nothing important." But the way she said it, the slight catch in her throat, suggested otherwise. I made a note to revisit this question later. The investigation began routinely enough. I photographed the scene, dusted for fingerprints, checked the locks and windows. The house was a modest 2-story structure in a quiet residential neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors and unusual activity rarely went unnoticed. Yet no one had seen anything suspicious. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, no sounds of forced entry. I spent the following days interviewing neighbors, reviewing security footage from nearby businesses, and researching the homeowner's background. Her name appeared in public records associated with a civil lawsuit from several years prior, though the details remained sealed by court order. When I mentioned this during our second meeting, her reaction was immediate and telling. Her face drained of color, and she excused herself to use the restroom, returning several minutes later with red-rimmed eyes. The lawsuit involved her former employer, a small accounting firm that had closed abruptly amid allegations of financial misconduct. She had been the office manager, responsible for maintaining client files and financial records. The firm's owner had disappeared shortly before the business folded, leaving behind a trail of missing funds and angry investors. She claimed to know nothing about the missing money, but several clients had named her specifically in their complaints. I began to understand why someone might be interested in the contents of her desk drawer. The deeper I dug into the case, the more complex it became. The missing employer had been found several months after his disappearance, living under an assumed name in a distant state. He was arrested and charged with embezzlement, but the majority of the stolen funds were never recovered. During his trial, he maintained that he had acted alone, but prosecutors suspected he had help from someone inside the office. Someone with access to client files and financial records. Someone like an office manager. I returned to the house with new questions. This time I asked directly about her relationship with her former boss. She admitted they had been close, perhaps closer than was appropriate for a professional relationship. He had confided in her about his financial troubles, his gambling debts, his desperate need for money, but she swore she had never helped him steal from clients. Her body language suggested otherwise. She avoided eye contact, spoke in short sentences, and repeatedly touched her neck where a faint tan line indicated she usually wore a necklace. When I asked about it, she said she had lost it recently. A gift from someone special, she added, but refused to elaborate. I spent the next week researching pawn shops and jewelry stores in the area. The necklace surfaced at a shop across town, sold for cash by a woman matching her description. The pawnbroker remembered her because she had seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her inside. When confronted with this information, she finally broke down and told me the truth. Her former boss had given her documents to hide insurance policies and financial records that could implicate her in the embezzlement scheme. She had kept them in her desk drawer for years, afraid to destroy them, but equally afraid to turn them over to authorities. Someone else knew about these documents, someone who had been pressuring her to hand them over. The break-in had not been random. Someone had come looking for those papers, and they had found exactly what they were searching for. But who and why now, years after the original crime? The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the case files from the embezzlement investigation, I discovered that one of the victims had hired a private investigator to locate the missing funds. This investigator had been methodically tracking down every lead, interviewing former employees, and searching for evidence that might lead to the recovery of the stolen money. He had recently contacted several people associated with the accounting firm, including the woman whose home had been burglarized. She had refused to meet with him, claiming she knew nothing that could help his investigation. But he had persisted, showing up at her workplace, calling her repeatedly, even following her home on at least one occasion. When I tried to contact this private investigator, I discovered he had left town suddenly, closing his office and forwarding his mail to an address that turned out to be a mail service with no forwarding information. His former secretary said he had received a large payment from a client and decided to retire early. She seemed genuinely surprised by his abrupt departure and had no idea how to reach him. The pieces began to form a disturbing picture. The private investigator had somehow learned about the hidden documents and had broken into the house to retrieve them. But what did he plan to do with this evidence? Turn it over to law enforcement? Use it to blackmail someone? Or was he working for someone else entirely? I shared my findings with the local police, but they seemed reluctant to pursue the matter. The homeowner had not reported any items stolen, they pointed out. Without evidence of theft or property damage, they could not justify opening a criminal investigation. They suggested she change her locks and install a security system. But I could not let the case rest. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, incomplete. I continued to investigate on my own time, driven by a growing suspicion that the break-in was connected to something much larger than a simple search for incriminating documents. The breakthrough came when I decided to visit the site of the former accounting firm. The building had been converted to retail space, but the landlord still had records from the previous tenants. Among these records was a forwarding address for mail that had continued to arrive for the missing business owner even after his arrest and conviction. The address led me to a storage facility where the convicted embezzler had apparently maintained a unit under a false name. The facility manager confirmed that someone had been paying the rental fees in cash, but the unit had been cleaned out recently. The timing coincided with the break-in at the woman's house. I began to suspect that the private investigator and the convicted embezzler were working together, possibly planning to recover the hidden funds and disappear permanently. The documents from the desk drawer might have contained account numbers, passwords, or other information necessary to access money that had been hidden offshore. But when I tried to verify the current whereabouts of the convicted embezzler, I made a shocking discovery. He had died in prison several months earlier, victim of what appeared to be a heart attack. The timing of his death, however, coincided with the period when someone had begun pressuring the woman to turn over the hidden documents. If the embezzler was dead, who was behind the break-in? Who had hired the private investigator? And what had really been in those documents that made them worth stealing? I returned to the woman's house one final time, hoping to find answers to these questions. She seemed different somehow, more relaxed, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. When I asked about the missing documents, she claimed to have no memory of what they contained. Just old business records, she insisted, nothing that would interest anyone. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made me pause. On her kitchen counter sat a travel brochure for a tropical destination, along with what appeared to be airline tickets. When I commented on her upcoming vacation, she smiled and said she had recently come into some money, an inheritance from a distant relative. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly rearranged themselves in my mind. What if the woman had not been a victim at all, but rather an active participant in the embezzlement scheme? What if she had been the one to hide the stolen funds, waiting for the investigation to die down before attempting to recover them? The documents in her desk drawer might have contained the information she needed to access those hidden accounts. But why stage the break-in? Perhaps to deflect suspicion, to make it appear that someone else was interested in the documents. Or maybe the private investigator had discovered her plan and attempted to blackmail her, forcing her to take more drastic action. I left her house that day with more questions than answers. The insurance company closed the case, satisfied that no actual theft had occurred. The police showed no interest in pursuing the matter further. The private investigator had vanished without a trace, and the woman was preparing to leave the country with her mysterious inheritance. Justice, it seemed, would remain elusive. The victims of the original embezzlement would never recover their money. The truth about what really happened in that quiet house would remain buried with the documents that had disappeared from the desk drawer. But sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I find myself wondering about that curtain that moved without any breeze. Was it simply a draft from an old house, or was someone else in that room, watching and waiting for the right moment to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs? The investigation officially ended, but the questions linger. In my profession, you learn to live with uncertainty, to accept that not every case has a satisfying resolution. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue, some secrets too valuable to reveal. The woman never returned from her vacation. Story 5. The main entry was locked on initial inspection. The corridor exhibited no disruptions, with framed pictures uniformly aligned along the walls. A solitary chair faced the window, its cushion undisturbed and free of indentations. An unopened package rested on the dining table, postage stamp unmarked. The kitchen was immaculate, with utensils stored methodically in drawers. A clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its hands signaling the exact hour. No exterior footprints were visible near the garden path, despite recent rainfall. Windows were latched securely. The rear door was unblemished, yet all calls remained unanswered. I keep returning to that chair, the way it faced the window, positioned with such deliberate precision. Someone had sat there watching, waiting. The fabric held no warmth when I pressed my palm against it, but fabric lies. It forgets quickly. The package bothers me more than it should. Brown paper, neat corners, no return address. The kind of careful wrapping that suggests ceremony or secrecy. I photographed it from 3 angles before anyone else arrived, though I'm not sure why. Something about the way the light fell across its surface seemed important. She called me the night before. I remember her voice carried that particular strain I'd learned to recognize, the one that meant she was standing by her kitchen sink, looking out at something I couldn't see. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a book she was reading. But underneath, always underneath, was that current of unease she'd carried for weeks. The detective asked if I noticed anything unusual during our conversation. I told him no, which wasn't entirely true. There had been a pause when I asked about her plans for the weekend, a hesitation that lasted just long enough for me to wonder what she wasn't saying. I found the spare key exactly where she'd always kept it, beneath the ceramic frog by the back steps. My fingers knew the hiding place before my mind remembered. How many times had I used that key over the years? Letting myself in with groceries when she was sick, checking on things when she traveled. The metal was cold and familiar against my palm. The house felt different that morning, not empty exactly, expectant, like it was holding its breath. I called her name when I entered, though the silence had already told me she wouldn't answer. My voice echoed strangely in the hallway, bouncing off walls that seemed closer together than I remembered. The framed photographs watched me pass. Her daughter's wedding, a vacation by the ocean, her late husband in his uniform, all of them perfectly straight, perfectly aligned. She'd been meticulous about such things. But had she always been so careful? I find myself questioning memories that once seemed solid. The woman I knew was organized, yes, but not obsessive. Not the type to arrange kitchen utensils with military precision or position a chair at such an exact angle to the window. The coffee maker was clean, spotless, no grounds in the filter, no residue in the carafe. When was the last time I'd visited and not found evidence of her morning ritual? She drank coffee the way other people breathed, constantly and without conscious thought. I opened the refrigerator without thinking, an automatic gesture born of familiarity. Inside, everything was arranged with the same unnatural order I'd found throughout the house. Condiments lined up by height, produce sorted by color. Even the milk carton had been positioned with its label facing perfectly forward. This wasn't her, not the woman who left magazines scattered across her coffee table and forgot to water her plants until they drooped with neglect. Someone had been here. Someone had cleaned and organized and arranged everything just so. Or maybe I never knew her at all. The phone records show she made 3 calls the night before she disappeared. One to me, one to her daughter, one to a number that traced back to a disconnected line. The police found this significant. I found it terrifying. Who calls a number that doesn't exist? I've been thinking about the last time we spoke in person. She'd invited me for dinner, something simple she said, just soup and bread. But when I arrived, the table was set with her good china, candles lit, wine already breathing in crystal glasses. She dressed carefully, too carefully for a casual meal between old friends. We ate in near silence. Every few minutes she would glance toward the window as if expecting someone. When I asked if she was all right, she smiled that bright, brittle smile I'd seen her use with strangers and said she was fine, just tired. I should have pressed, should have asked the questions that hovered between us like smoke. Instead, I helped her wash dishes and kissed her cheek goodbye, promising to call soon. The package haunts my sleep. Brown paper wrapping, no return address, sitting on her dining table like an offering or a threat. The police opened it eventually, found nothing but tissue paper and a small jewelry box, empty, the kind of container that holds promise until you lift the lid. Who sends an empty box? I drive past her house sometimes, though I tell myself I'm just taking a different route home. The new owners have painted the shutters blue and planted flowers where she grew vegetables. They've moved the ceramic frog, too. The hiding place for the spare key is just another spot in the garden now. But I remember where it was. I remember the weight of that key in my hand, the way the back door swung open on hinges that needed oil. I remember stepping into her kitchen that morning and knowing, immediately and completely, that something fundamental had changed. The chair still faces the window in my mind. I see it clearly, positioned with mathematical precision, waiting for someone who will never return. Sometimes I wonder if she's still sitting there, invisible and patient, watching for whatever she expected to come up that garden path. The clock on the mantel kept perfect time. Even the police remarked on it. But I knew she'd been having trouble with that clock for months, constantly adjusting it, complaining that it ran slow. When had she fixed it? And why did that feel like the most important question of all? I wake up thinking about her hands, the way they moved when she was nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring or smoothing her hair. Restless hands that could never quite find peace. Yet everything in that house spoke of stillness, of careful placement and deliberate calm. The investigation continues, though I sense it's becoming routine now, a box to be checked rather than a mystery to be solved. The detective calls occasionally with updates that aren't really updates, no new leads, no fresh evidence. No answers to the questions that multiply in my mind like shadows at dusk. But I keep thinking about that empty jewelry box, about the phone call to a disconnected number, about the way she arranged everything so perfectly before she vanished, as if she were setting a stage for a play that would never be performed. Or maybe one that already had been. The silence in her house wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of held breath, of secrets kept so carefully they'd become part of the architecture. I felt it the moment I stepped inside, that sense of waiting, of expectation unfulfilled. Something was supposed to happen in that house, something that required perfect order, precise positioning, meticulous preparation. The chair facing the window wasn't furniture anymore. It was a witness stand, and she was both judge and jury, waiting for a verdict that never came. Or did it? I close my eyes and see her sitting there, hands folded in her lap, watching the empty garden path with infinite patience. The package on the table behind her, the clock marking time with mechanical precision, the house holding its breath around her like a prayer. And I wonder if she's still waiting, or if she finally saw what she'd been watching for, walking up that path where no footprints were found, approaching the door that remained locked from the inside. The ceramic frog sits in my garden now. I couldn't leave it there for strangers to discard or break. Sometimes I catch myself checking beneath it, though I know the key is long gone. Some habits die harder than the people who created them. But every time I touch that cool ceramic surface, I remember the weight of her secret in my palm, the way trust feels when it's made of metal and hidden in plain sight. And I wonder what other secrets she kept, and whether some doors are meant to stay locked forever. Story 6. The stairwell didn't groan beneath my weight. My footsteps felt hollow, but they refused to announce themselves, swallowed by the stillness. The banister should have been cool to the touch, but it was neither here nor there, like an untold story hiding in plain sight. Each step was an act of faith, but the path gave nothing back, offering no comfort or warning. Reaching the landing, I paused, expecting a shift in the air, a signal that never came. The walls seemed to lean closer, as if waiting for a revelation, though none would ever surface. I tell myself I came here to collect her belongings. That's what people do when someone leaves suddenly, isn't it? They gather the remnants, sort through the debris of an interrupted life. Her apartment door stood ajar when I arrived, the way she always left it when expecting visitors. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting familiar shadows across furniture I'd helped her arrange just weeks before. The explanation makes perfect sense. She'd been planning to move back east for months, talking about fresh starts and new opportunities. The job offer came through faster than expected, she said. Corporate relocation, everything had to happen quickly. She called me the night before, her voice bright with excitement and tinged with that particular sadness that comes with sudden departures. Could I handle the loose ends, forward her mail, water the plants until the landlord sorted things out? I moved through her rooms methodically, filling boxes with books, folding clothes that still carried her scent of vanilla and something sharper, more complex. Her coffee maker sat on the counter, unplugged but still warm to the touch. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay beside it, her pen marking the last word she'd considered, vanish to disappear suddenly. But something felt wrong about the pen. Not wrong exactly, displaced, like it belonged to a different moment entirely. The boxes filled quickly. Her life seemed smaller when contained this way, reduced to manageable portions. I found her passport in the bedside drawer, exactly where she always kept it. The photo showed her smiling, eyes bright with possibility. Everything suggested an orderly departure, a life transitioning rather than ending. Yet as I packed, fragments of wrongness accumulated like dust in corners. The milk in her refrigerator had expired 2 weeks ago. Her favorite sweater, the one she wore whenever traveling, hung in the closet undisturbed. The answering machine blinked with 17 unheard messages, dating back to the day after her supposed departure. I pressed play, my own voice emerged, calling to confirm dinner plans we'd made for the weekend after she'd supposedly left. Then my voice again, confused, asking why she'd stood me up, then concerned, then desperate. The messages painted a different timeline, one where her departure story crumbled under the weight of abandoned commitments and unanswered questions. My hands trembled as I reached for the machine's reset button, but stopped. Something about the gesture felt familiar, rehearsed. Had I done this before? The sensation lingered, a phantom memory of standing in this exact spot, performing this exact motion, while a different version of events played out around me. The apartment seemed to shift then, walls breathing with secrets I couldn't quite grasp. I remembered arriving here that night, not this morning. The door hadn't been ajar but locked, and I'd used the spare key she'd given me months before. The lights were off. The silence was different, heavier, pregnant with something that made my skin crawl. In this other memory, she was here. Not gone, not relocated, but present in a way that defied explanation. We'd argued about something important, something that mattered enough to raise voices and slam doors, but the details slipped away like water through my fingers whenever I tried to focus on them. I found myself standing in her bedroom, staring at the unmade bed. In my rational version of events, she'd simply left in a hurry, too excited about her new opportunity to bother with housework. But another part of me remembered the sheets being different that night, darker, disturbed in ways that suggested struggle rather than sleep. The smell hit me then underneath the vanilla and that sharper note I couldn't identify. Something metallic and organic, like copper pennies left in rich soil. It was faint but persistent, seeming to emanate from the floorboards themselves. I knelt and pressed my palm against the wood. The boards felt solid, unremarkable, but my body remembered a different texture, a slight give where something had soaked through and dried. My knees remembered this position, this exact angle, while my hands worked to clean something that shouldn't have been there. The two versions of reality began to blur, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. In one, I was a helpful friend managing the mundane details of relocation. In the other, I was something else entirely, moving through a choreography of concealment and misdirection that felt as natural as breathing. I stood and walked to her desk, where a letter waited in her handwriting. The paper felt fresh, the ink slightly smudged as if written hastily. It explained everything: the sudden opportunity, the rushed timeline, the regret at leaving without proper goodbyes. Her signature looked perfect, exactly as I remembered it. But my fingers traced the letters with muscle memory that suggested practice. How many times had I written her name, perfecting the loops and curves until they flowed effortlessly from my pen? The thought arrived unbidden, accompanied by flashes of sitting at this same desk, copying her handwriting from old birthday cards and shopping lists until the mimicry became second nature. The phone rang, startling me from these uncomfortable revelations. Her voice greeted me from the answering machine, bright and cheerful, explaining that she couldn't come to the phone right now but would return calls as soon as possible. I'd helped her record that message months ago, coaching her through multiple takes until she sounded perfectly natural. But I also remembered recording it again more recently, using equipment I'd borrowed and techniques I'd researched. The technology wasn't difficult once you understood the principles. Voice modulation, digital splicing, the subtle art of making the dead speak with convincing warmth. The caller was her mother, worried about missed calls and forgotten birthday wishes. The old woman's voice cracked with concern as she spoke to the machine, asking why her daughter had become so distant, so unreachable. I made a mental note to call her back, using the voice I'd perfected and the explanations I'd rehearsed. But another part of me wondered if I'd already made that call, if the worried mother had already been satisfied with stories of new jobs and fresh starts, if the web of deception had already expanded beyond these walls to encompass everyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. The afternoon light shifted, casting new shadows across the room. I realized I'd been here for hours, moving between two versions of the same story without resolution. In one, I was cleaning up the loose ends of a friend's sudden departure. In the other, I was maintaining an elaborate fiction that required constant attention and careful maintenance. Both versions felt equally real, equally false. My memories supported each narrative with perfect clarity while simultaneously undermining them with contradictory details. I was both innocent and guilty, both helpful and deceptive, both mourning a loss and celebrating a successful cover-up. The boxes sat packed and labeled, ready for storage or disposal. The apartment looked exactly as it should for someone who'd left in a hurry, but planned to return someday for forgotten belongings. Everything was perfect, plausible, carefully arranged to support the story I'd chosen to tell. But underneath that perfection, other truths whispered through the floorboards and lingered in the corners where shadows gathered. The smell of copper and earth, the memory of struggle and the weight of consequence. The practiced motion of hands that knew how to clean, how to hide, how to make problems disappear. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, pocketing the key. Tomorrow I'd call the landlord, arrange for the boxes to be collected, ensure that all traces of her occupancy were properly erased. The story would hold because I'd make it hold, because the alternative was unthinkable. Walking down the stairwell, my footsteps echoed differently than they had on the way up. The sound was fuller now, weighted with knowledge I couldn't quite acknowledge. The banister felt solid under my palm, real in ways it hadn't been before. But as I reached the bottom step, doubt crept back in. Had I really spent the day packing boxes, or had I spent it perfecting a story that would never quite convince anyone who looked too closely? Was I preserving the memory of a friend, or was I maintaining the fiction that had become more real than reality itself? The questions followed me into the street, where normal life continued its predictable patterns. People walked past without seeing me, without recognizing the weight I carried or the uncertainty that had become my constant companion. I was just another person running errands, managing the small crises that life inevitably provides. The truth, whatever it was, would remain locked in that apartment, in the spaces between memory and confession, in the careful balance between what happened and what I needed to believe had happened. Some stories are too dangerous to finish, too fragile to examine too closely. I drove home through familiar streets, carrying boxes filled with a life that may or may not have ended the way I remembered. The radio played softly, voices discussing weather and traffic as if the world hadn't shifted fundamentally around me. Perhaps it hadn't. Perhaps some uncertainties are meant to remain unresolved, suspended between possibility and truth like dust motes in afternoon light, Story 7. It was a faint hiss like the release of air from a forgotten tire. My fingers froze on the coat I was shrugging off, the fabric suddenly foreign against my skin. The sound persisted in the quiet room, seeming to seep from the corners or maybe from behind the faded wallpaper where it didn't belong. I stood at the threshold, straining to catch its source, as if detecting a flicker just beyond my sight. The hiss grew quieter as I edged closer, a sibilant whisper that tugged at the fringes of a memory I couldn't quite grasp. My heart thudded against ribs turned to stone. That sound hadn't slipped into my life since the night everything unraveled. Now it was back. The coat fell to the floor with a soft thud. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a small sound could carry so much weight, could drag me back to that place where certainty dissolves like sugar in rain. The hissing had stopped, but its echo remained lodged somewhere behind my sternum, a phantom pressure that made breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. I suppose I should explain how I came to recognize that particular sound, though explanation suggests clarity, and clarity has been a stranger to me for some time now. The human mind, I've learned, has a peculiar way of filing away details we don't yet understand we'll need, like the way shadows fall differently when someone is watching from a window, or how footsteps sound hollow when they're meant to be silent. The first time I heard that hiss, I was standing in my kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hands. It was the kind of morning that feels suspended, caught between what was and what might be. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, the faucet dripped its steady rhythm, and then there it was, that soft release of air that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I set down my coffee and followed the sound, the way you might follow a thread through a maze, not knowing if it leads to the center or deeper into confusion. It led me to the basement door, which stood slightly ajar. I don't remember leaving it open, but memory has become an unreliable narrator in my life. The hissing grew stronger as I descended the wooden steps, each creak announcing my approach to whatever waited below. The basement smelled of damp earth and old paint, familiar scents that should have been comforting but felt somehow altered, as if viewed through a different lens. The sound was coming from behind the water heater, that hulking white cylinder that had been there since before I moved in. I knelt on the concrete floor, my knees protesting against the cold, and peered into the shadows. There was nothing visible, nothing obviously wrong, yet the hissing continued with the persistence of a secret demanding to be told. I pressed my ear closer to the metal, and the sound seemed to shift, to move, like something alive but not quite breathing. My skin prickled with the kind of awareness that comes when you realize you're not alone, even when logic insists you are. I called a repair service, of course. What else do you do when confronted with mechanical mysteries? The technician arrived with tools and confidence, examined every pipe and connection with the thoroughness of a surgeon. He found nothing wrong. No leaks, no loose fittings, no explanation for the sound that had driven me from sleep and into the realm of doubt. After he left, I sat in my kitchen again, staring at the basement door. The hissing had stopped during his visit, as if it understood the need for discretion. But I could feel it waiting, patient as a predator, ready to resume its whispered commentary on my unraveling peace of mind. That's when I began to notice other things, small disruptions in the order of my days. A book moved from one shelf to another. A window that I was certain I'd locked found standing open to the night air. The kind of changes that could be explained by forgetfulness, by the ordinary chaos of living, if you were inclined toward reasonable explanations. But reason, I discovered, is a luxury that abandons you when you need it most. Instead, I found myself cataloging these small disturbances, creating a taxonomy of unease that grew more elaborate with each passing day. The moved book became evidence of an intruder. The open window suggested surveillance. The hissing sound transformed from mechanical malfunction to something far more personal, more intentional. I began to watch my own house, studying it with the intensity of a detective examining a crime scene. I memorized the position of every object, the angle of every curtain, the precise way shadows fell across the hardwood floors. I developed rituals of verification, checking locks multiple times, photographing rooms before I left so I could detect any changes upon my return. The photographs were revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated, not because they showed evidence of disturbance, but because they captured something else entirely, the gradual transformation of familiar spaces into territories of suspicion. My home, viewed through the camera's eye, looked different, staged, as if someone had been rearranging not just objects, but the very atmosphere of the place. I studied those images for hours, comparing them frame by frame, searching for proof of what I felt but couldn't name. The coffee table shifted 3 inches to the left, a lampshade tilted at a different angle. The cushions on the sofa compressed in a pattern that didn't match my usual habits of sitting. Or perhaps I was seeing patterns where none existed, the way clouds can look like faces if you stare long enough. The mind, desperate for meaning, will create connections from the thinnest threads of evidence. I knew this, understood it intellectually, yet couldn't stop myself from weaving those threads into an increasingly complex web of possibility and paranoia. The hissing returned sporadically, never when I was actively listening for it, always when my attention was elsewhere. I would be reading or cooking or lost in some mundane task, and there it would be that soft exhalation that seemed to comment on my activities with knowing disapproval. I began to think of it as a companion, unwelcome but persistent, a reminder that privacy might be an illusion I'd been clinging to without realizing how fragile it was. I started leaving the house more often, seeking refuge in public spaces where the rules of engagement were clear and witnesses were abundant. Coffee shops became sanctuaries where the ambient noise could drown out the whispers of my imagination. Libraries offered the comfort of other people's stories, fictional troubles that made my own seem less substantial. But even there I felt watched, not by any particular person, but by the collective gaze of possibility itself. The woman reading in the corner might be taking notes on my behavior. The man checking his phone could be receiving updates on my location. The barista's friendly smile might mask a deeper knowledge of my circumstances. I realize how this sounds, how the telling of it reveals the extent to which doubt had colonized my thoughts. But understanding the irrationality of a feeling doesn't automatically neutralize its power. Fear operates on a different frequency than logic, and once it finds a foothold, it can build elaborate structures from the smallest fragments of uncertainty. The night everything changed, or the night I finally recognized that everything had already changed, I was lying in bed, listening to the house settle around me. Old buildings have their own language of creaks and sighs, a vocabulary of wood and metal that speaks of time and weather and the slow surrender to gravity. I had learned to distinguish between the ordinary complaints of aging infrastructure and the more subtle sounds that didn't belong. The hissing began around midnight, soft at first, then growing in confidence like a voice finding its strength. It seemed to be coming from multiple locations now, not just the basement but from the walls themselves, as if the house had developed a respiratory system and was breathing in rhythm with some alien purpose. I rose from bed and moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, following the sound as it led me on a tour of my own life. In the living room, it whispered from behind the bookshelf where I kept photographs of people whose faces had begun to seem unfamiliar. In the kitchen, it murmured from beneath the sink where pipes disappeared into darkness. In the hallway, it sighed from the heating vents that connected every room in an invisible network of metal arteries. I found myself back at the basement door, my hand on the knob, hesitating at the threshold between the known and the unknowable. The hissing was strongest here, most insistent, as if whatever was making the sound had been waiting for this moment of decision. I opened the door and descended into the darkness, guided by the sound and by something deeper than curiosity, a need to finally confront whatever had been sharing my space, my thoughts, my increasingly fragmented sense of reality. The basement felt different in the middle of the night, larger somehow, as if the walls had retreated to accommodate shadows that daylight kept at bay. The hissing led me to the far corner, to a space I rarely visited, where cardboard boxes held the accumulated debris of a life lived elsewhere. I knelt among them, listening, and the sound seemed to be coming from within the boxes themselves, from the stored memories and abandoned possessions that I'd been carrying from place to place without ever examining their contents. I opened the nearest box with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the anticipation of discovery. Inside were papers, documents, letters, the bureaucratic remnants of relationships and transactions that had once seemed important, but underneath, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled like autumn leaves, was something I had forgotten I owned. A small recording device, the kind used for interviews or note-taking, its red light blinking steadily in the darkness. The hissing was coming from its tiny speaker, the sound of tape running through mechanisms that had been activated by some timer or remote signal I couldn't identify. I picked it up with the careful attention one might give to a venomous snake, aware that this moment would divide my life into before and after. I pressed the stop button and the hissing ceased. The silence that followed felt profound, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to consider. The device was warm in my hands, as if it had been running for hours, days, perhaps weeks. How long had it been recording? What had it captured during its patient surveillance of my private moments? I carried it upstairs to the kitchen, set it on the table under the harsh fluorescent light, and stared at it as if it might reveal its secrets through observation alone. The recording device looked innocuous enough, the kind of technology that could be purchased at any electronic store, used for any number of legitimate purposes. but its presence in my basement, hidden among forgotten belongings, suggested purposes that were far from innocent. I should have called the police. That would have been the rational response, the action of someone whose grip on reality remained firm. Instead, I found myself wondering how long I had been living under observation, how many of my private moments had been captured and preserved by this mechanical witness. The questions multiplied like cells dividing, each one spawning new possibilities for violation and betrayal. Who had placed the device? How had they gained access to my home? What did they hope to learn from the mundane details of my solitary existence? But underneath these practical concerns ran a deeper current of unease, the growing suspicion that the device might not be the cause of my troubles, but merely a symptom of something larger and more complex. Perhaps I had placed it there myself, during some forgotten episode of paranoia or preparation. Perhaps the hissing I had been hearing was not evidence of surveillance, but of my own mind creating the very threats it feared. The morning found me still sitting at the kitchen table, the recording device between my hands like a puzzle box whose solution might destroy the person attempting to solve it. Daylight had a way of making nocturnal discoveries seem less urgent, more amenable to rational explanation. But it couldn't erase the fundamental questions that the device's presence had raised about the nature of privacy, trust, and the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives. I never did listen to the recordings. Some truths, I decided, were too dangerous to confront directly. Instead, I removed the batteries and placed the device in a drawer where it could neither record nor accuse. The hissing stopped, but the silence it left behind felt temporary, conditional, like a held breath waiting to be released. The coat still lies on the floor where I dropped it, fabric pooled in the afternoon light that slants through windows I no longer trust to keep the world at bay. I should pick it up, restore order to the small chaos of my entrance, but movement feels premature. The hissing has returned, faint as a whisper, persistent as memory, reminding me that some sounds once heard can never be completely silenced. My fingers reach for the collar, and I wonder if this is how it always begins, with the recognition of a sound that shouldn't exist, in a place where secrets gather like dust in corners we never think to claim. Story 8. The latch didn't click behind me. I leaned against it, feeling for the solid comfort of a lock engaging, but the silence stretched unnaturally. Each step into the dim hallway was met with an absence, the air too still, as if even echoes refused to linger. My fingers brushed over the velvet rail, expecting dust, but it was oddly clean, like the touch of someone gone but recent. The usual murmur of the ceiling fan above remained dormant, its stillness clinging to the room like a cold draft. I paused by the entrance to an unlit corridor, sensing a pressure at my back, an expectation unfulfilled. The darkness around was thick, offering no passage, only reflection. The mirror at the end of the hallway caught what little light filtered through the curtained windows. Its surface held a strange quality, not quite reflecting the space as I remembered it. The frame, ornate brass with small cherubs carved into the corners, seemed too elaborate for this modest house. I had always wondered where it came from, though I never asked. Now, staring at my own face in its depths, I noticed how the glass distorted my features slightly, making my eyes appear larger, more questioning than they felt. The photographs lining the wall beside me told a story I thought I knew by heart. Family gatherings, holiday celebrations, moments of manufactured joy captured in silver frames. But something about their arrangement troubled me now. The spacing between them was too precise, too deliberate, as if someone had measured the distances with a ruler. In one image, I recognized my own younger face, but the person standing next to me had been carefully cropped out, leaving only a shadow of an arm draped across my shoulders. The carpet beneath my feet was Persian, its deep reds and blues forming patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The wool was thick enough to muffle footsteps, which explained why I hadn't heard anyone moving through the house earlier, or perhaps no one had been moving at all. The thought settled uneasily in my mind as I traced the intricate border with my eyes, following geometric shapes that repeated endlessly, creating an optical illusion of depth. The door to the study stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of the room beyond. The mahogany desk dominated the visible space, its surface cleared of everything except a single fountain pen lying at an odd angle. The pen was expensive, the kind that required real ink, the kind that left permanent marks. I remembered the sound it made when writing, the soft scratch against paper that had once been comforting but now seemed ominous in my memory. The smell of old books permeated the air near the study, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Not quite medicinal, but clinical somehow, like the scent of a hospital waiting room. The leather-bound volumes on the shelves had always been more decorative than functional, purchased by the foot rather than by interest, yet someone had been reading them recently. I could tell by the way certain spines were slightly pulled forward, creating tiny shadows in the otherwise perfectly aligned collection. The telephone on the side table was an antique rotary model, its black surface polished to a mirror shine. The receiver rested in its cradle at a slight angle, as if it had been replaced hastily. I found myself staring at it, waiting for it to ring, though I couldn't remember the last time anyone had called this number. The silence around it felt expectant, pregnant with conversations that might have taken place while I was away. The curtains in the living room were drawn tight against the afternoon light, creating an artificial twilight that made everything appear muted and dreamlike. The fabric was heavy brocade, expensive and formal, hanging in perfect folds that suggested they hadn't been disturbed in some time. Yet I had a clear memory of opening them that morning, of sunlight streaming across the hardwood floor in golden rectangles. The grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 20 minutes past 3. Its pendulum hung motionless behind the glass door, and the weights had descended as far as they could go. The silence where its steady tick should have been felt like a missing heartbeat. I couldn't remember when I had last wounded it, or if it had been my responsibility at all. The time it displayed meant nothing to me, yet it felt significant, like a marker of some important moment I had forgotten. The coffee table bore the ring stains of countless cups and glasses, white circles overlapping in a pattern that spoke of long conversations and comfortable silences. But the surface had been polished recently, the wood gleaming despite the accumulated damage. Someone had taken care to preserve even the imperfections, as if they were evidence of something worth remembering. The fireplace was cold, its grate swept clean of ash. The poker set beside it stood at attention, each tool in its proper place. Above the mantel, a landscape painting depicted a scene I almost recognized: rolling hills under a stormy sky, a lone figure walking a dirt path that disappeared into shadow. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but something about its posture suggested urgency or perhaps fear. The throw pillows on the sofa were arranged with the same precision I had noticed in the photographs. Each one perfectly positioned, corners aligned, colors coordinated in a way that felt studied rather than natural. I had the distinct impression that someone had been sitting here recently, but had taken great care to erase any evidence of their presence. The reading lamp beside the armchair cast a circle of warm light that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. The bulb was old-fashioned, with visible filaments that created interesting shadows on the walls. Beneath it, an open book lay face down, its pages splayed in a way that would damage the binding. This carelessness struck me as wrong, inconsistent with the meticulous care evident everywhere else. The hardwood floor creaked in specific places as I moved through the room. The sounds formed a pattern I recognized from years of walking these boards, but tonight the familiar groans seemed to echo differently, as if the house itself was trying to tell me something. Near the window, one floorboard was slightly raised, creating a small ridge that caught at my toe. The window latch was loose, rattling slightly when the wind pressed against the glass. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see the garden beyond, overgrown and wild in a way that suggested neglect. The roses had grown leggy and unpruned, their blooms small and sparse. Someone had once cared for this garden with great attention, but that care had ceased some time ago. The kitchen doorway framed a scene of domestic normalcy that felt somehow theatrical. Clean dishes were stacked in the drying rack, a dish towel hung neatly from its hook, and the counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But the refrigerator hummed with an irregular rhythm, and the faucet dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop landing in the exact center of a water stain in the sink. The refrigerator's surface was covered with newspaper clippings held in place by colorful magnets. The article seemed random at first glance: a recipe for apple pie, a review of a play I had never heard of, a brief mention of someone receiving a community service award. But as I read more carefully, I began to notice connections, threads of meaning that suggested these clippings had been chosen deliberately. The basement door was locked, its key missing from the hook where it usually hung. The door itself was solid oak, painted white but showing chips and scratches near the handle from years of use. A thin line of light showed beneath it, suggesting someone had left the basement lights on, or perhaps someone was down there now. The staircase to the second floor stretched upward into darkness, its banister smooth from countless hands sliding along its length. The steps were carpeted with the same Persian runner that covered the hallway floor, but here the pattern seemed different somehow, as if the carpet had been replaced with something similar but not identical. The difference was subtle, noticeable only to someone who had climbed these stairs thousands of times. The family portrait at the landing showed faces I recognized but couldn't quite place in my current reality. The expressions were formal, frozen in the way of old photographs, but the eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. One face in particular drew my attention, a woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes, whose hands were folded in her lap in a way that suggested tension rather than repose. The master bedroom door was closed, but light seeped around its edges in thin golden lines. The doorknob was warm to the touch, as if someone had been gripping it recently. I could hear something from within, not quite movement, but a presence that made the air feel occupied. The sound was rhythmic, like breathing, but too slow and deliberate to be natural sleep. The guest room at the end of the hall stood empty, its bed made with military precision. The corners of the sheets were folded into perfect hospital corners, and the pillows were fluffed and positioned exactly in the center of the headboard. A suitcase sat on the luggage rack, closed but not locked, as if its owner had stepped out temporarily and would return at any moment. The bathroom mirror reflected a face I barely recognized as my own. The features were correct, but something in the expression seemed foreign, as if I was looking at a photograph of a stranger who happened to resemble me. The medicine cabinet behind the mirror was slightly ajar, revealing bottles of prescription medications with labels I couldn't read from this angle. The attic access panel in the ceiling showed signs of recent disturbance. The paint around its edges was chipped, and a small pile of plaster dust had accumulated on the floor below. A stepladder leaned against the wall nearby, positioned as if someone had climbed up to investigate what lay hidden in the space above. The final element that captured my attention was the most ordinary and yet the most unsettling. On the hall table, exactly where I had left it that morning, sat my own set of keys. They were arranged in a neat line, each key facing the same direction, polished to a shine that reflected the dim light like tiny mirrors. But I was certain I had taken these keys with me when I left the house. I could feel their weight in my pocket even now, could hear their familiar jingle when I moved. Yet here they were, impossibly present in both places at once, suggesting that either my memory was failing me or someone else had been here. Someone who knew exactly how I arranged my belongings. Someone who wanted me to notice this small but significant discrepancy in the otherwise perfect preservation of my absence. Story 9. The weight of silence. I told them the lights were off when I left. They seemed satisfied, scribbling down notes before moving to the next question. But those dim reflections still lingered in my memory, bending strangely against the polished floor. The scent of damp wood and burnt coffee filtered through the air, heavy and cloying. In the silence, a subtle creak, rhythmic like a slow heartbeat, echoed from somewhere unseen. An overturned chair cast a jagged shadow that bore no reason to exist. Fingers trembled as they brushed the cool metal of the railing, feeling the faint warmth it shouldn't have held. My shoes left no prints, yet the dust rippled as if unsettled. The tick of a distant clock was the only other witness, enigmatic and unhurried, and I never mentioned the door that eased quietly closed behind me. The detective across from me had tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much and believed too little. His pen scratched against yellow paper, filling line after line with my carefully measured words. I watched his face for any sign of suspicion, but found only the practiced neutrality of someone who had conducted 1,000 interviews just like this one. "Let's go back to the beginning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of routine. "You arrived when exactly?" The question hung between us like smoke. I had rehearsed this moment, played it out in my mind during sleepless nights when the memory of that evening refused to fade. Yet sitting here now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station, the truth felt heavier than I had anticipated. "Late afternoon," I replied, keeping my voice steady. The sun was already setting behind the trees. What I didn't tell him was how the light had filtered through the windows in a way that made everything look underwater. How the familiar hallway had stretched longer than it should have, lined with photographs that seemed to watch me pass. The house had always been old, but that evening it felt ancient, as if it were holding its breath. She had called me earlier, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify. Not fear exactly, but close to it. A tremor that made me grip the phone tighter as she asked me to come over. Said she needed to show me something. Said it couldn't wait. The detective flipped to a fresh page. "And you found her where?" "The living room," I said, the words tasting like copper. She was sitting in her chair, the blue one by the window. But that wasn't entirely accurate either. She had been positioned in the chair, arranged almost, with her hands folded neatly in her lap and her head tilted at an angle that suggested sleep. Except her eyes had been open, staring at something just past my shoulder, something that wasn't there. The room had been pristine, more organized than I had ever seen it. Books aligned perfectly on their shelves, cushions plumped and centered, not a speck of dust on any surface. It was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. She had never been neat, had always lived surrounded by comfortable chaos. Magazines scattered across tables, coffee cups forgotten on windowsills, sweaters draped over chair backs like shed skins. "Did you touch anything?" The detective's question pulled me back to the present. "I checked for a pulse," I said, which was true. What I didn't mention was how cold her skin had felt, or how my fingers had lingered longer than necessary, searching for some sign of the warmth that had always radiated from her. how I had whispered her name into the silence, hoping for an answer that never came. The detective made another note. Medical examiner estimates she had been gone for several hours before you arrived. Several hours, the phrase echoed in my mind as I nodded appropriately. But if that were true, why had the coffee cup on the side table still been warm to the touch? Why had the impression of someone sitting on the sofa cushion still been visible, as if whoever had been there had only just stood up? "We'll need you to walk us through everything you observed," he continued. "Take your time." Time, such a fluid concept in that house, in that room where shadows fell at impossible angles and silence had weight. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back, past the sanitized version I had been feeding the detective, into the raw memory of what had actually happened. The front door had been unlocked when I arrived, which should have been my first warning. She was meticulous about security, always had been, ever since the break-in 2 summers ago. But the door had swung open at my touch, revealing the hallway that stretched into dimness. I had called out her name, my voice swallowed by the peculiar acoustics of the space. The house had always been quiet, but this was different. This was the quiet of held breath, of secrets pressed between walls. The living room had drawn me like gravity, not because I knew she was there, but because something about the quality of light spilling from that doorway felt urgent, important, as if the house itself were trying to tell me something. And there she had been, positioned in that chair like a museum exhibit. The late afternoon sun streaming through the window behind her, casting her face in sharp relief, beautiful and terrible and wrong. Did she seem troubled lately? The detective's voice cut through my reverie. Any problems you were aware of? I considered the question carefully. She had seemed different in recent weeks, more withdrawn than usual. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Long stares out windows at nothing I could identify. A tendency to start sentences and then abandon them halfway through, as if she had forgotten what she meant to say. "She mentioned some concerns," I said finally. "Nothing specific." But that wasn't entirely honest either. She had been specific, terrifyingly so. Late one evening, over wine that had made her more talkative than usual, she had told me about the feeling of being watched, not from outside, she had clarified, but from within the house itself, as if the walls had developed eyes. I had dismissed it as loneliness, the kind of hypervigilance that comes from living alone in a house too large for one person. Now I wondered if I should have listened more carefully. The detective closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "We'll be in touch if we have any other questions. Thank you for your cooperation." I nodded and stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. The interview was over, but the weight of what I hadn't said pressed down like a physical thing. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a long while, staring at the brick facade of the police station and trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit. The coroner had ruled it natural causes, a heart attack, swift and without warning. At her age, with her medical history, it wasn't unexpected. The detective had seemed satisfied with the explanation, ready to file the case away and move on to the next tragedy waiting on his desk. But I couldn't shake the memory of that perfectly arranged room, the warm coffee cup, the impression on the sofa cushion, the way the shadows had fallen in patterns that defied the position of the sun. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the house. The family had asked me to help sort through her belongings, a task that felt both necessary and invasive. Each room held layers of accumulated life, decades of collected moments that now seemed fragile as tissue paper. In her bedroom, I discovered a journal tucked beneath her mattress. The pages were filled with her careful handwriting, documenting the last few months of her life in meticulous detail. Most entries were mundane, records of doctor appointments and grocery lists and observations about the weather. But scattered throughout were references to sounds in the night, footsteps in the hallway when she was certain she was alone, the sensation of being watched through windows that looked out onto empty yards, and recurring mentions of a visitor she never quite named, someone who came by in the afternoons when the light was fading. The final entry was dated the same day she died, just 3 words written in handwriting that seemed less steady than usual. They are here. I closed the journal and sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by the detritus of a life cut short. The room smelled like her perfume, a scent that had always reminded me of gardenias and rain. But underneath it was something else, something sharp and metallic that made my throat constrict. The house creaked around me, settling into evening shadows. From somewhere downstairs came the sound of a door closing, soft but distinct. I froze, listening for footsteps that never came. The silence stretched until I convinced myself it had been the wind or the natural expansion and contraction of old wood. But as I made my way downstairs, journal clutched in my hands, I noticed things that hadn't been there before. A coffee cup on the kitchen counter, still warm to the touch. An impression on the living room sofa, as if someone had been sitting there moments before my arrival. The front door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it behind me. I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. No response came, but the quality of the silence had changed. It no longer felt like the quiet of an empty house, but rather the held breath of someone trying not to be discovered. That night I couldn't sleep. The journal lay on my bedside table like an accusation, its pages filled with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. In the darkness of my own bedroom, I found myself listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps in hallways, doors opening and closing, the whisper of fabric against fabric, as if someone were moving through rooms they had no right to occupy. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. The detective's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the undercurrent of something more urgent. "We need to ask you a few more questions," he said. "Some new information has come to light." At the station, he led me to the same room where we had talked before, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a dark suit sat across from the table, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself as an investigator from the state police, though she never explained why her involvement was necessary. "We've been reviewing the case," the detective began, "and there are some inconsistencies we'd like to clarify." My mouth went dry. What kind of inconsistencies? The woman leaned forward, her eyes fixed on my face. The medical examiner found something unusual during the autopsy, traces of a sedative in her bloodstream. Nothing lethal, but enough to cause disorientation. The room seemed to tilt around me. "I don't understand." "Neither do we," the detective said, "which is why we're hoping you can help us figure out how it got there." They asked me the same questions as before, but with a different weight behind them. My answers felt inadequate, full of holes that I couldn't explain. Yes, I had been to the house that afternoon. No, I hadn't noticed anything unusual about her behavior. No, I had no idea how sedatives might have entered her system. But even as I spoke, fragments of memory began to surface. The way she had seemed drowsy during our last conversation, her words slightly slurred. How she had mentioned feeling tired all the time, despite sleeping more than usual. the glass of water on her nightstand, half empty and tasting faintly bitter when I had sipped it out of curiosity. "We'll need you to stay available," the investigator said as the interview concluded. "This is now an active investigation." I drove home through streets that seemed unfamiliar, though I had traveled them countless times before. The landscape felt altered, as if the revelation of possible foul play had shifted the fundamental nature of reality. Trees cast shadows that fell in wrong directions. Buildings leaned at angles that defied physics. At home, I pulled out the journal again, reading through the entries with new eyes. The references to being watched took on a more sinister cast. The mysterious afternoon visitor became a potential threat rather than a figment of loneliness. And those final words, "they are here," felt less like paranoia and more like a warning. That evening, I made a decision that would haunt me for weeks to come. I returned to her house, using the key she had given me months ago for emergencies. The building stood dark against the evening sky, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. Inside, the air felt thick with secrets. I moved through rooms that seemed to shift around me, familiar spaces rendered strange by shadows and silence. In the kitchen, I found the cabinet where she kept her medications. Bottles lined up in neat rows, each labeled with careful precision. But there were gaps in the arrangement, spaces where bottles should have been, and on the counter nearby, a small pile of white powder that could have been anything, could have been nothing. My hands shook as I collected a sample in a small envelope, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. The powder felt gritty between my fingers, leaving a residue that I couldn't seem to wash away no matter how many times I scrubbed my hands. From upstairs came the sound of movement, not footsteps exactly, but the whisper of fabric against walls, the creak of floorboards under weight that shouldn't exist. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to sounds that could have been the house settling or could have been something else entirely. The rational part of my mind insisted I was alone. The investigation had been thorough. The house had been searched and cleared. But rationality felt thin in the face of what I was hearing, what I was feeling in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step an act of will. The hallway stretched before me, lined with photographs that seemed to watch my progress. Her bedroom door stood open, revealing shadows that moved independently of any light source I could identify. Inside the room, everything appeared exactly as I had left it, but the air held a different quality, as if someone had been breathing it recently. The impression on the bed where I had sat earlier was gone, the comforter smooth and undisturbed. On the nightstand, the glass of water I remembered from my previous visit had been refilled. Fresh condensation beaded on its surface, though the house had been empty for days. I backed out of the room and down the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. At the front door, I paused with my hand on the knob, listening to the silence that followed me. It felt expectant, as if the house were waiting for something to happen. Outside, the night air tasted like rain and secrets. I sat in my car for a long while, staring at the dark windows of the house and trying to make sense of what I had experienced. Logic insisted that grief was playing tricks with my perception. That guilt over not recognizing the signs of her distress was manifesting as paranormal experiences. But the envelope of white powder in my pocket felt real enough, as did the memory of that fresh glass of water beaded with moisture that shouldn't have existed. The next morning, I called the detective and told him about the powder I had found. He listened without comment, then asked me to bring it in for analysis. His tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the questions he wasn't asking. Questions about why I had returned to the house, about what else I might have discovered, about what else I might be hiding. At the station, I handed over the envelope and answered another round of questions that felt increasingly like an interrogation. Yes, I had a key to the house. No, I hadn't told anyone about returning there. Yes, I understood that tampering with a potential crime scene was a serious offense. The investigator from the state police was there again, her presence adding weight to every exchange. She asked about my relationship with the deceased, about any conflicts we might have had, about my whereabouts during the days leading up to her death. I answered as honestly as I could, but honesty felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. How could I explain the sensation of being watched in an empty house? How could I describe the sound of movement where no movement should exist? How could I make them understand that the house itself seemed complicit in whatever had happened? "The powder you found," the detective said finally. "Preliminary tests suggest it's the same sedative we found in her system." The words hit me like cold water. What does that mean? "It means someone was drugging her," the investigator said. "The question is who." They released me with the usual warnings about staying available and not leaving town, but as I walked to my car, I could feel their eyes following me. I had become a suspect in my own grief, a person of interest in a tragedy I was still trying to understand. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. She had been acting strangely for weeks before her death. The journal documented her growing paranoia, her sense of being watched and followed. Someone had been visiting her in the afternoons, someone she never quite identified. And now there was evidence that she had been systematically drugged, her judgment compromised, and her ability to defend herself diminished. The heart attack that had killed her might have been natural, but the circumstances leading up to it were anything but. I thought about the warm coffee cup I had found that first evening, the impression on the sofa cushion, the door that had closed behind me as I left. Had someone been there with her when she died? Had someone watched her final moments and then slipped away into the gathering darkness? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through my consciousness until I could think of nothing else. I rose from bed and began pacing my apartment, moving from room to room in search of some escape from the weight of uncertainty. On my kitchen table lay the journal, its pages filled with her increasingly frantic observations. I opened it again and read through the final entries, looking for clues I might have missed. Her handwriting grew less steady as the days progressed, the letters wavering as if her hand had been shaking. But it was the entry from 3 days before her death that stopped me cold. Buried in a paragraph about grocery shopping and doctor appointments was a single sentence that changed everything. Saw them at the market today, pretending not to notice me. Them, not him or her, but them. Multiple people, a conspiracy rather than a single predator. I read the sentence again and then again, each repetition adding weight to its implications. She hadn't been paranoid, she had been hunted, and in the end her hunters had found their mark. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed the detective's number, though it seemed impossibly late for official business. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Some things happened." He wouldn't elaborate over the phone, but his tone carried an urgency that made my stomach clench. I dressed quickly and drove through empty streets to the police station, where he met me in the lobby with an expression I couldn't read. "The house was broken into tonight," he said as he led me to his office. "Someone tore the place apart." My legs felt unsteady. Was anything taken? That's what we're trying to figure out, but here's the interesting part. Whoever did it was looking for something specific. They ignored electronics, jewelry, anything with obvious value. Instead, they focused on papers, documents, personal effects. He showed me photographs from the crime scene, drawers pulled out and overturned, papers scattered across floors, bookshelves emptied of their contents. It looked like the aftermath of a tornado, but a selective one that had targeted only certain types of items. "They were looking for evidence," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "That's what we think too, which suggests that whatever happened to her, it wasn't random. Someone planned this, and now they're trying to cover their tracks." I thought about the journal safely tucked away in my apartment. Had they been looking for it? Did they know it existed? And if so, how long before they traced it back to me? "We're going to need you to think carefully about anything else you might have removed from the house," the detective continued. "Anything that might explain why someone would take this kind of risk." I hesitated, weighing the implications of full disclosure against the growing certainty that I was in deeper than I had realized. The journal contained evidence of a conspiracy, proof that her death hadn't been natural. But it also made me a target, someone who possessed information that others were willing to kill for. "There might be something," I said finally, "but I'll need protection if I turn it over." The detective's expression sharpened. "What kind of something?" "A journal." She kept detailed records of everything that was happening to her, including descriptions of the people who were watching her. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The journal was logged into evidence after being photographed page by page. A safe house was arranged, though the detective warned me it might only be temporary. Most importantly, a task force was assembled to investigate what was now clearly a homicide disguised as natural death. But even surrounded by law enforcement professionals, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. That somewhere in the shadows, the same people who had stalked her were now turning their attention to me. The journal revealed more than I had initially realized. Her careful documentation included license plate numbers of cars that appeared repeatedly outside her house, descriptions of individuals who seemed to turn up wherever she went, and most damning of all, a pattern of symptoms that clearly indicated systematic poisoning over a period of weeks. She had been murdered slowly, methodically, by people who wanted her death to appear natural. The sedatives had been just one component of a larger plan designed to weaken her resistance and cloud her judgment. In the end, the heart attack that killed her might have been induced by the very drugs that were meant to keep her compliant. The investigation that followed uncovered a conspiracy that reached further than anyone had imagined. She hadn't been a random victim, but rather a targeted one. Someone who had seen something or known something that made her dangerous to the wrong people. But even as arrests were made and charges filed, questions remained. The house continued to feel haunted by more than just memory. Sounds echoed through empty rooms where no sounds should exist. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard her voice calling my name from places she could never be. The trial, when it finally came, provided answers to some questions while raising others. The defendants were convicted, their conspiracy exposed, and their methods revealed. Justice of a sort was served. But justice couldn't restore the trust that had been shattered. couldn't erase the knowledge that evil could wear familiar faces and speak in friendly voices. Couldn't explain why I still sometimes found warm coffee cups in empty rooms, or why doors continued to close behind me when no one else was there. Some mysteries, I learned, are meant to remain unsolved. Some truths are too heavy for human comprehension. And sometimes the only honest answer to the question of what really happened is that we may never fully know. The house stands empty now, its windows dark and its rooms silent. But silence, I have discovered, is not the same as emptiness, and darkness can hide truths that daylight is too weak to reveal. I still have dreams about that final afternoon, about the moment I found her arranged so carefully in that blue chair by the window. In my dreams, she turns to look at me, her eyes filled with knowledge I'm not ready to receive. And always, just before I wake, she whispers the same words that ended her journal. They are here. The question that haunts me now is not who they were, or even why they chose her. The question is whether they're finished with their work, or whether her death was simply the first movement in a longer, more complex symphony of violence. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I wonder if the person sitting across from that detective, answering questions with such careful precision, was really me at all. Or if I too had become someone else entirely. Story 10. I mentioned to them that I had simply walked by. Thus, the creaking of the floorboards must have been someone else's footsteps echoing down the hallway. The air on the landing was heavy, carrying a scent of damp earth, an aroma uncharacteristic for an indoor space. My shoes left slight indentations in the dust, like new memories unwilling to fade. The gentle hum from the dim light above flickered inconsistently, casting fleeting shadows that didn't belong to any familiar shape. My heartbeat whispered against my ribs, a hidden drumbeat beneath the surface calm. Still, I assured myself the doorway hadn't widened in my absence, yet the warmth lingered on my palms. The warmth, that's what keeps coming back to me when I try to piece this together. My palms remember things my mind refuses to hold on to. I press them against my jeans now, trying to scrub away whatever phantom heat still clings there, but it's like trying to wash off a birthmark. They ask me questions, I remember that much. The way their voices seem to come from underwater, distant and distorted. Someone wrote things down, the scratch of pen on paper, methodical and patient. But when I try to recall what I told them, the words scatter like startled birds. I was there to fix something, or maybe to check on something. The details blur together, but I remember the key in my hand, how it felt heavier than it should have. The lock turned too easily, as if it had been waiting for me. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered. That's impossible, of course. Buildings don't change their dimensions between visits, but I counted my steps that day, and there were more of them than there should have been. 37 steps from the entrance to the landing. I had walked that same path before, and it had never been 37 steps. Someone had been there recently. The dust patterns told stories I didn't want to read. Footprints that weren't mine, smaller than mine, circling in patterns that made no sense. Why would someone walk in circles in an empty hallway? The thought makes my chest tight even now. I should have left then. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to turn around, lock the door behind me, and forget I had ever been there. But something pulled me forward, not curiosity, something deeper than that, something that felt like obligation. The scent of damp earth grew stronger as I approached the landing. It reminded me of childhood summers, of digging holes in the backyard for no reason other than to see how deep I could go. But this smell was different, older, more patient. The light fixture hummed its inconsistent tune, and I found myself timing my breathing to its rhythm. In when it brightened, out when it dimmed. It was hypnotic in a way that made my thoughts feel thick and sluggish. That's when I saw the door. Not the door I was supposed to check on, a different door, one that hadn't been there before, or maybe one I had somehow never noticed despite walking past it countless times. The wood was darker than the others, and there was no number on it, no nameplate, nothing to indicate what lay beyond. My hand was on the knob before I realized I had moved. The warmth hit me then, spreading up my arm like fever. The metal was hot, uncomfortably so, but I couldn't seem to let go. "Don't," someone said, or maybe I said it. The voice seemed to come from inside my own head, but it didn't sound like my voice. It sounded younger, frightened. I turned the handle anyway. The room beyond was smaller than it should have been, smaller than the space it occupied could possibly contain. The walls seemed to press inward, and the ceiling hung lower than physics would allow. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that I recognized it. Not the room itself, but the feeling of it, the way the air moved, the particular quality of light that filtered through windows I couldn't see. It was like stepping into a photograph from a dream, familiar and impossible at the same time. There was furniture, though I struggled to describe it now. Shapes that suggested chairs and tables, but when I tried to focus on any one piece, it seemed to shift and blur, like looking at stars that disappear when you stare directly at them. Something sat on what might have been a desk, a small object dark against the uncertain surface. I moved toward it without deciding to, my feet carrying me forward while my mind lagged behind, still trying to process what I was seeing. The object was warm when I picked it up, warm like the door handle, warm like the blood in my veins. It fit perfectly in my palm, as if it had been made for my hand specifically. The weight of it was comforting and terrible at the same time. I should remember what it was. The shape of it is burned into my palm like a brand, but when I try to visualize it, my mind slides away from the memory like water off glass. All I know is that holding it felt like coming home and falling off a cliff simultaneously. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said again. Definitely not my voice this time, definitely not in my head. I turned, but the room was empty, had always been empty. The furniture shapes were gone, leaving only bare walls and dusty floorboards. The object in my hand felt heavier, more real in contrast to the dissolving space around it. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dust, fresh ones leading from where I stood to where the door should have been. But there was no door anymore, just a blank wall, unmarked and unbroken. The footprints were small, child-sized. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path backward from the wall to my feet, but they didn't lead to where I was standing. They led to a spot 3 feet to my left, where nothing stood but empty air. My reflection wasn't in the window when I looked. The glass showed the room behind me, showed the footprints and the dust and the flickering light from the hallway beyond, but it didn't show me. I waved my hand in front of the glass, watched the space where my reflection should have been remained stubbornly empty. The object in my hand grew warmer. I ran then, or I think I ran. The hallway stretched and contracted around me like a living thing, and my footsteps echoed in patterns that didn't match my stride. 37 steps became 43, then 29, then something that couldn't be counted because the numbers kept changing. The key was still in my hand when I reached the entrance. Both keys now, though I don't remember picking up the second one. The object from the room sat heavy in my other palm, though when I looked down, my hands appeared empty. Outside, the world resumed its normal proportions. The building behind me looked exactly as it always had, unremarkable and solid, but when I counted the windows, there was one more than there should have been. A dark window on the second floor, in a space that shouldn't exist. They found me sitting on the steps. I don't know how long I had been there. Long enough for the shadows to shift, for the light to change quality. Long enough for someone to worry and come looking. "What happened in there?" they asked. I told them I had simply walked by. The words came out of my mouth without my permission, smooth and practiced, as if I had rehearsed them. But even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of the object in my palm, could smell the damp earth that still clung to my clothes. They wrote down what I said, asked more questions. I answered them all, but I couldn't tell you now what those answers were. The words seemed to bypass my conscious mind entirely, emerging from some deeper place that knew what needed to be said. Later, alone in my own space, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I drew diagrams of the hallway, counted and recounted the steps, tried to map the impossible geometry of that room. But every time I got close to understanding, the details would shift and blur, leaving me with nothing but the persistent warmth in my palms and the lingering scent of earth. I went back the next day, had to go back. The key felt alive in my pocket, pulsing with its own heartbeat. But the door was gone, not locked, not boarded up. Gone. The wall where it had been was seamless, as if no door had ever existed there. I ran my hands over the surface, searching for any sign of an opening, but found only smooth plaster and the faint vibration of something moving behind it. The footprints were still there in the dust, child-sized and circling, leading nowhere and everywhere at once, but now there were more of them. Adult-sized prints joining the smaller ones in their endless dance. I recognized the tread pattern on the larger prints, the distinctive wear pattern on the heel. They were mine, but from a visit I couldn't remember making. The warmth in my palms intensified. I started keeping a journal after that, trying to capture the fragments before they could slip away. But the words on the page never matched the words in my mind. I would write about doors and hallways and find myself reading about gardens and rain. I would try to describe the object I had held and discover paragraphs about birds and broken windows. The journal pages multiplied overnight. I would go to sleep having written 3 pages and wake to find dozens, all in my handwriting, all describing things I had no memory of experiencing. Places I had never been, conversations I had never had, people whose faces I couldn't recall, but whose voices echoed in my dreams. Someone called me recently, or maybe I called them. The voice was familiar in the way that childhood songs are familiar, recognizable without being placeable. "You found it, didn't you?" they said. I wanted to ask what I had found, but the words wouldn't form. My throat felt thick with dust and secrets. "It's been waiting so long," the voice continued. "We've been waiting so long." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me holding a phone that felt too warm against my ear. I checked the call log, but there's no record of any recent calls. Just empty spaces where conversations should have been, like gaps in a smile where teeth used to be. The building is scheduled for renovation. I read about it in a newspaper that I found folded neatly on my doorstep, though I don't remember subscribing to any local publications. The article is brief, mentioning structural irregularities and the need for extensive modifications. They're going to tear down the interior walls, reconfigure the layout, modernize the electrical systems. Everything that makes the building what it is will be stripped away and rebuilt. I wonder what they'll find behind those walls, what explanations they'll offer for the impossible spaces and the scent of damp earth in places where no earth should be. I wonder if they'll find the door. The object is still with me, though I can't see it or touch it in any conventional sense. It exists in the space between my fingers, in the warmth that never fades, in the weight that has no mass. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it in reflections, a dark shape nestled in my palm like a sleeping bird. I dream about the room now, not the empty space I found, but the room as it was meant to be, filled with furniture that holds its shape, windows that show views of places that might actually exist, and in the center of it all, a child sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with objects that cast no shadows. The child looks up when I enter, and I see my own eyes looking back at me, but younger, before I learned to forget things that didn't fit into the world's neat categories. "You came back," the child says, and their voice is the voice I heard in the hallway, the voice on the phone, the voice that whispers in the spaces between my thoughts. I want to ask them who they are, but I already know. They are the part of me that never left that room, the part that has been waiting patiently for me to remember what I chose to forget. The warmth spreads from my palms up my arms, and I understand that I am not holding the object anymore. The object is holding me. I mentioned to them that I had simply walked by, but walking by isn't the same as walking through, and walking through isn't the same as walking back. The footsteps in the dust tell their own story, circling endlessly, waiting for someone to read the pattern and understand its meaning. The floorboards still creak in that hallway, though I'm no longer sure whose footsteps caused the sound. The air still carries the scent of damp earth, and my shoes still leave indentations in the dust like memories that refuse to fade. But now I know why the doorway seemed to widen in my absence, and why the warmth lingers on my palms even when I'm nowhere near that place. Some doors once opened never really close, and some footsteps once taken echo forever in the spaces between what we remember and what we choose to forget. The light still flickers in that hallway, casting shadows that belong to no familiar shape, but I think I'm beginning to recognize them after all.